June 12, 1945. The war was over, but peace hadn't arrived. In a small German village, rain fell through the broken roofs, washing over bomb craters and burnt fields. The air still smelled of smoke, oil, and fear. Then something strange happened. Men who had once cheered for Hitler now carried shovels, not to fight, but to bury 5 American pilots who had crashed nearby. They didn't curse them. They didn't look away. They laid them to rest with flowers and folded flags. It made no sense. How could a defeated people honor the very men who bombed them? And yet, that single act of mercy would change how an entire town remembered the war. This is the story of forgiveness, where none was expected, and the village that chose humanity over hatred. Stay till the end to see how it happened. And if you love stories of real courage and compassion, please like this video, subscribe, and help us keep these forgotten moments of history alive. In the spring of 1945, the war was ending, but not in any way that felt like victory. In the German village of Kleinrath, the air still smelled of coal dust and burned straw. Roofs were patched with tar paper, and at night the wind whistled through holes left by shrapnel. Chickens scratched at the frozen mud beside the old churchyard. The people who lived here no longer looked up when they heard aircraft. They simply waited for the rumble to fade. Bread was rationed to 200 grams per person. The butcher's window was empty, and the last horse had been requisitioned for the Wehrmacht months earlier. "We were tired of uniforms," recalled one villager, an old farmer named Otto Klein. "They brought nothing but news of sons who wouldn't come home." Then, on an overcast morning in April, the silence broke, not by artillery, but by the sputter of engines in distress. Overhead, an American B-17 was limping east, black smoke trailing from one wing. Its aluminum skin glinted briefly through a gap in the clouds before it vanished behind the ridge. Moments later, there came the dull concussion of impact, distant, then terribly near. The villagers felt it in their chests. Children were the first to run toward the smoke. Adults followed reluctantly, knowing what they might find. The wreckage lay half buried in a field of winter wheat. Metal shards steamed in the cold drizzle, parachute silk tangled in the trees. The smell was unmistakable: fuel, cordite, and scorched rubber. For the first time, the war had fallen directly into their soil. The paradox was immediate. For years, propaganda had painted Allied pilots as Terrorflieger, sky bandits who bombed civilians for sport. Yet, when the villagers found the bodies, there was nothing monstrous about them. They were young, no older than their own sons, and their faces, blackened with soot, looked strangely peaceful. One woman, Marta Bauer, remembered how her hand shook as she touched a broken dog tag. "It said U.S. Army Air Forces," she whispered later, "and I thought, somewhere a mother is waiting for this boy." She crossed herself, though the priest had not yet returned to the village. That night, Kleinrath's people gathered in the church, its stained glass shattered, the pews cold. They lit candles from the rationed stubs of tallow and debated what to do. Some argued the bodies should be turned over to the local command post, better to avoid trouble. Others said they should be buried quickly, before the wolves came down from the woods. But a few voices, trembling but resolute, said something else entirely. "They fought as ours did," one man said, "and they are dead now. What more punishment do they need?" Outside, the moon rose behind smoke, and the bells of nearby villages tolled for German soldiers lost at the front. Yet in Kleinrath, a different kind of decision was taking shape, quiet, almost defiant. By morning, spades were gathered. The ground was hard, and every strike of iron on earth echoed through the valley. Each shovelful felt like a confession. "It was strange," Bauer said. "We dug for them as if we were burying our own shame." That afternoon they carried the airmen's bodies, wrapped in parachutes, faces covered, to the churchyard. No music, no priest, no orders. Only the sound of crows and the thud of earth on metal. Children stood at the gate, clutching wildflowers. The villagers bowed their heads, not knowing the right words, but knowing this felt right. In that moment, Kleinrath ceased to be just another defeated place. It became something else, a village caught between guilt and grace, between what it had been told and what it now chose to believe. The war still raged elsewhere, but here, amid ashes and silence, forgiveness had begun to take root in the soil. And as the last shovel fell, someone murmured what others could not yet say aloud. They were enemies only until they fell. But this was only the beginning. The fields beyond Kleinrath were still heavy with the scent of spring rot, wet hay, diesel, and the faint tang of burned oil that never seemed to leave the air. For days after the crash, children whispered about the iron bird lying broken beyond the woods. Farmers walking to their pastures paused, eyes drifting toward the ridge where the American bomber had fallen. It was as if a scar had opened in their landscape, one that refused to close. The B-17 had been part of the 402nd Bomb Group, returning from a raid over Mersburg. Of the 10-man crew, 3 had died on impact, 2 more in the tangled wreck, and 5 had bailed out somewhere over the hills. The Luftwaffe command in the region, what little remained of it, reported Feindlicher Absturz, unbestätigt, an enemy crash, unconfirmed. The war machine no longer had time for paperwork. For the villagers, confirmation came in smaller human forms. A boy of 12 found one of the parachutes snagged in a hedgerow, the silk torn and stained dark. A helmet lay nearby, its leather strap stiff with dried mud. Later that evening, a farmhand stumbled upon one of the surviving airmen, dazed and limping, his flight jacket half burned. The man raised his hands and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper, "Please, no more." No one knew what to do. For years, harboring the enemy had meant imprisonment or worse. Yet when they looked at the wounded man, his pale skin, the trembling in his fingers, they saw not a conqueror, but a boy. The village midwife, Frau Lenz, cleaned his wounds with boiled water. He smelled of smoke and salt, she remembered, and when he tried to thank me, he said the word mutter. I don't think he knew what else to call a woman then. There was danger in every act of mercy. The local constable, still wearing his tattered uniform, warned them that Allied soldiers were not to be aided. The penalties, he said, were schwer und endgültig, severe and final. But already the power of such warnings had thinned like the pages of a used ration book. The Reich was collapsing. Even fear was running out of breath. The paradox deepened. Those who had lost everything to Allied bombs were now saving Allied lives. Their roofs were gone, their barns burned, their sons buried beneath the flag of the very nation these airmen served, and yet compassion overruled vengeance. Maybe we were tired of hating, Otto Klein would later say. It demanded too much energy, and we had none left. By the third day, U.S. soldiers, infantry moving in from the west, reached the area. Their trucks rolled past the smoking ruins of barns, through streets littered with bicycles and white flags. They found the downed airmen's graves marked by wooden crosses, carefully carved with names copied from dog tags. One of the Americans, a chaplain, wrote in his field diary, "It stunned us. The graves were neat, the flowers fresh. These people, who'd been told we were monsters, had done what we hadn't yet had the chance to do ourselves." The discovery made its way up the chain of command, eventually reaching headquarters near Kassel. For once, the report was not about troop movements or ammunition counts. It was about decency. In a war that had devoured 60 million lives, a village of 200 souls had chosen to act differently. But not everyone approved. Some in Kleinrath feared retribution, not from the Americans, but from their own. Word spread that Nazi loyalists in nearby towns called them Verräter, traitors who buried the enemy while German soldiers rotted unburied in foreign fields. Others whispered that the villagers had lost their minds. Still, the graves remained, the flowers were replaced, and when the wind blew through the hedgerows, it carried the faint rattle of the wreckage, a reminder that the line between guilt and grace was razor-thin. The war was almost over, but the real battle, the one for memory, was just beginning. The morning after the Americans arrived, Kleinrath woke beneath a pale, unsteady sun. Smoke still curled from the blackened barns, but in the churchyard, the air was different, almost fragile, like something waiting to be protected. Villagers gathered quietly, their boots scraping the frost-hardened soil. They came not out of duty, but curiosity, perhaps even guilt. No banners, no uniforms, no speeches. Only faces, lined, tired, uncertain, staring at 5 wooden crosses that bore names they could barely pronounce. Lieutenant James R. Collins, Sergeant Peter H. Delaney, CPL, Norman F. White, T. Sergeant Robert M. Hale, Pist Arthur King. Each cross had been made from the beams of a collapsed barn, each carved by hand. The paradox was unavoidable. These were enemies, yet they were being buried in the very soil their bombs had once torn open. And it was the villagers, the same people who had hidden from those bombs, who now knelt to honor them. Marta Bauer, the widow who had lost her husband on the Eastern Front, was the first to step forward. She carried a small bouquet of forget-me-nots. "For their mothers," she whispered, placing the flowers before the center grave. Her fingers trembled as if each petal carried its own confession. The old school teacher, Herr Vogel, spoke next, not in sermon but in fragments. "They were men," he said simply, "and men belong to the earth when they die, not to nations." His voice cracked and no one applauded. They only nodded, as if acknowledging something ancient and overdue. The U.S. chaplain, Captain Alan Morris, stood back, removing his cap. He later wrote in his journal, "I expected bitterness. Instead, I saw reverence. These people, hungry, beaten, half-broken, had found a way to be more human than war allowed. The villagers' children, barefoot despite the chill, carried more flowers, dandelions, buttercups, whatever they could find. They arranged them clumsily over the mounds, bright smudges against the dark soil. A dog barked somewhere beyond the hedgerows, then fell silent. At noon, a lone trumpet, an American GI's instrument, sounded taps. The notes drifted unevenly, carried by the wind. The villagers did not understand the words, but they understood the feeling, loss that belonged to everyone. There was an odd peace in the air that day. The war had not yet officially ended. Fighting still burned in pockets across Bavaria, but in Kleinrath, something final had already occurred, not surrender, but release. "Hatred," Otto Klein muttered to his neighbor, "cannot fill an empty stomach." It was not cynicism, but truth. Compassion had become a kind of survival, moral as much as physical. Later, some villagers tried to count the cost. They knew 410 Allied bombers had fallen over Germany that year alone. Each one carried young men who believed they were ending the war faster. The arithmetic of loss was staggering, but what haunted them more was the arithmetic of mercy, how few had chosen it. When dusk fell, the candles flickered in the broken church windows, their light reflected in the puddles left by spring rain. No one dared to say they were proud, but neither did they feel shame. Something beyond those words had taken hold. A letter arrived weeks later, written by one of the surviving airmen from a hospital near Kassel. It was addressed simply to the people of Kleinrath. Inside, in careful handwriting, it read, "I don't know your names, but you gave my friends a home in the ground. That is more than war deserves. You showed me that even where hate was ordered, mercy disobeyed." The letter was passed from hand to hand, and some said they saw tears on the paper. By the time summer came, grass had grown over the graves. Children chased fireflies between the crosses. To outsiders, it looked like a simple cemetery. To the villagers, it was a quiet rebellion, proof that, even in defeat, they could choose dignity. But the world beyond Kleinrath was not ready to forgive so easily. and soon their small act of peace would draw a much harsher kind of attention. By July 1945, the fields around Kleinrath shimmered green again. Wheat swayed where craters had been, and children laughed in the same meadows where months earlier bodies had lain among the wreckage. The war, for the first time in years, felt distant, like a storm that had passed, leaving the air raw and strangely clean. Yet in the churchyard, 5 wooden crosses kept the memory alive. On the morning of July 28th, an American jeep rattled into the village square. Dust trailed behind it, and the hum of its engine drew curious faces to the windows. Inside were 3 men in pressed uniforms, 1 officer, 2 enlisted, and a folded flag. They had come not as occupiers, but as pilgrims. Captain Morris, the same chaplain who had attended the first burial, stepped out holding a bouquet of wildflowers. "We thought they should have these," he said quietly to Otto Klein, who stood at the gate. "From their families, from home." It was a strange sight. An American flag carried through a German village, still heavy with the smell of rationed soup and coal smoke. Yet no one protested. The villagers followed silently as the men made their way to the churchyard. There the chaplain knelt. One by one he placed the flowers upon the graves, then unfolded the stars and stripes. Its colors were vivid even in the gray morning light. He laid it gently across the center mound. For a long moment no one spoke. Then something unexpected happened. Marta Bauer, still wearing her husband's old coat, stepped forward and placed her own bouquet beside his. "For both flags," she said softly, "for the living and the dead." The paradox was breathtaking. Beneath the ruins of the Reich, a German widow and an American chaplain stood side by side, united not by politics, but by grief. That image, 2 figures framed by broken gravestones and a tattered church wall, would later appear in Allied newspapers under the headline, "A Village Forgives." The article described how a small German town had tended the graves of 5 American airmen with dignity and compassion rarely seen in war's wake. For many readers, it was the first story from Germany that wasn't about hatred or punishment. But inside the village, reactions were mixed. Some felt pride, others feared the attention. "We didn't do it for the newspapers," said Herr Vogel, the schoolteacher. "We did it because it was right." Even so, the presence of the flag changed everything. It was a visible declaration in a place still learning how to speak again. When the American soldiers left, they left the flag behind. For days, villagers took turns watching over it. An odd act, given that for years that same banner had been their symbol of fear. Children would touch its fabric as if it might tell them what peace felt like. The local priest, recently returned from a labor camp, conducted a belated service. His voice trembled as he read from Matthew, "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." For months such words had sounded like mockery. Now they sounded like permission. Statistics from that summer tell a grim story. Across Germany, over 26,000 Allied airmen remained missing or unburied. Most were never found. But in Kleinrath, 5 had been given names, flowers, and rest. The airfield at Kassel sent word that the families of the dead would be notified of the village's gesture. A letter arrived soon after from a woman in Illinois, Mrs. Collins, mother of the bomber's pilot. Her handwriting was steady but raw. "If ever you pass where my boy lies, tell him his mother thanks you. You made strangers into kin." The letter was pinned to the church door. For days, villagers stopped to read it, some tracing the words with their fingers. By then, the fields had turned gold. Harvest came, and life, in its quiet way, returned. But the graves remained the village's truest monument, not of defeat nor of shame, but of something far rarer, conscience. And far beyond Kleinrath, others began to notice, reporters, officers, even politicians. Forgiveness, it seemed, was contagious, and not everyone approved. Autumn arrived early that year. carried by a wind that smelled of wet earth and smoke from newly lit stoves. Kleinrath had survived another winter's beginning, but this time there was no curfew, no siren, no threat from the sky. Only the echo of a memory they could neither silence nor forget, the crash, the graves, the flag. By then the Americans had moved on, replaced by occupation officials and administrators who viewed compassion with suspicion. Yet in the homes of the villagers, stories of that spring still circulated like sacred folklore. Each retelling changed slightly, shaped by who was listening and what they had lost. Old Marta Bauer spoke often of the boys, as she called the airmen. They looked so young, she'd tell the children, eyes distant. Their faces were black from the fire, but when you cleaned them, they could have been ours. Her words were not poetic invention. They were an admission of guilt and grace intertwined. Others remembered smaller details. The schoolteacher recalled the smell of scorched fabric when they cut the parachutes free. The blacksmith remembered finding a photograph, 3 smiling young men in front of an aircraft, burned at the edges, but still intact. They carried their families with them, he said, even into death. Some villagers kept mementos, a button, a buckle, a torn flight glove. They were hidden in drawers, not as trophies, but as proof of something unspoken, that humanity had survived the war, even if victory had not. One of the surviving airmen, Sergeant Harold Hal Morgan, later recorded his memories in a letter to the families of the fallen. He described waking in a field hospital near Kassel, learning that 5 of his crewmates were buried by the people who had once been his enemy. "I couldn't believe it," he wrote. "I thought they'd have left us in the dirt, but instead they gave us graves, and someone even prayed. I don't know what kind of people they were, but they were better than the war allowed them to be." Morgan's letter was published in an American newspaper in early 1946. It spread quietly at first, then quickly, retold in churches and civic halls across the Midwest. For families still grieving the missing, the story of Kleinrath became a kind of salve, a reassurance that somewhere in the rubble of Europe, decency had survived. Yet back in Germany, the story stirred unease. The mayor of a nearby town accused Kleinrath of betraying German sacrifice. Some veterans called it sentimental surrender. They couldn't understand how a community so recently bombed could honor the bombers. But those who had lived it didn't see contradiction. They saw necessity. "We had buried too much hate already," said Otto Klein. "If we kept digging graves for that, none of us would be left." Numbers tell a larger truth. Between 1943 and 1945, over 45,000 U.S. aircraft were lost or damaged in the European theater. Behind those machines were nearly 500,000 airmen. Every wreck carried 10 lives, and 10 mothers, 10 homes, 10 stories. In Kleinrath, 5 of those stories ended in peace instead of erasure. Years later, in an interview for a post-war oral history project, Captain Morris reflected on that paradox. "We expected hostility," he said. "What we found was repentance dressed as kindness. But maybe that's how forgiveness begins, not with words, but with hands that refuse to harm again." As winter approached, the graves disappeared under snow. The villagers continued to bring candles, pressing them into the drifts so that the light glowed softly against the white. Each flame flickered like a heartbeat, fragile, temporary, but undeniable. And through that long, dark season, stories traveled beyond Kleinrath, to officials in Frankfurt, to American newspapers, to mothers who would never see their sons again. The dead could not speak for themselves, but the living had begun to tell their story for them. Still, not everyone saw it as redemption. Some saw it as defiance. And soon, that quiet act of mercy would meet the full machinery of politics. By early 1946, the story of Kleinrath had traveled farther than any of its people ever had. American newspapers called it a village without hate. British radio spoke of Germans who remembered humanity. And in the new administrative offices of the Allied occupation, the reports were read with equal parts curiosity and caution. Forgiveness, after all, could be politically inconvenient. The village itself was small, barely 300 residents, but now it was a symbol. Every action, every rumor, every visitor was recorded by both German authorities and American intelligence officers. Captain Morris returned once more, this time not as chaplain, but as observer. "We wanted to see," he wrote, "whether kindness can survive scrutiny." In the churchyard, the 5 crosses still stood. The flag was carefully folded now, kept inside the church's altar chest to protect it from weather and thieves. Flowers continued to appear, though fewer now. Life had resumed its steady grind of ration lines and rebuilding. Then came the first letter from Berlin, typed, official, cold. It informed the village that the unofficial maintenance of enemy graves might be interpreted as an unauthorized political statement. The irony was thick. Men who had buried the dead in silence were now accused of making noise. Mayor Vogel called a meeting in the schoolhouse. The villagers sat on wooden benches, coats still damp from the rain. "They think we are disloyal," he said, reading the letter aloud. "They say we honor those who destroyed our homes." A murmur rippled through the crowd, anger, confusion, disbelief. "But did we not also destroy theirs?" asked Marta Bauer quietly. The room fell silent. Her voice carried more truth than any official decree. Still, the risks were real. New local administrators, eager to prove their allegiance to the occupation government, warned that public displays of sympathy for the enemy might be misunderstood. Some whispered that Kleinrath's residents were trying to curry favor with the Americans. Others feared being branded collaborators. The paradox was cruel. The very act that had redeemed them morally now threatened to condemn them politically. Across Germany, similar stories emerged, but were swiftly suppressed. Villages that had tended Allied graves were advised to defer all commemorative activity until proper channels were established. Bureaucracy, it seemed, was determined to manage mercy. Yet the Americans themselves faced a dilemma. Reports of sympathetic Germans conflicted with the narrative of total guilt that justified occupation policies. One colonel, reading Morris's account, wrote in the margin, "Sentimentality compromises justice." And still, the graves remained. When spring returned, a small delegation from the U.S. Graves Registration Service arrived with trucks and shovels. Their orders were to exhume Allied remains for transfer to official cemeteries. The villagers watched as the men worked in silence. The air was heavy with the scent of fresh soil and motor oil. "It felt like they were taking something of ours," said Otto Klein later. "Not the bodies, the meaning." When the trucks departed, leaving behind only the empty holes, the villagers stood wordless. Even the birds seemed to avoid the churchyard that day. "For a year we kept them safe," Bauer said softly, "and now they are gone. But we will still remember where they lay." That night candles appeared again in the church windows, not for the dead they were gone, but for what the dead had awakened. Statistically, the removal was part of a vast operation. Between 1945 and 1950, more than 280,000 American war dead were repatriated or reburied in official cemeteries. It was an immense effort of honor, but it could not account for what had happened in places like Kleinrath. Bureaucracy could relocate bones, but not meaning. Years later, Captain Morris would write, "I watched them dig up those boys and realized something I hadn't during the war. Mercy doesn't follow orders. It grows where it's not supposed to." The graves were gone, but the memory remained a quiet defiance, a truth too human for politics to erase. And soon, that truth would find a voice far beyond the valley. By the 1950s, Kleinrath was no longer just a name on a map. It had become a story retold in classrooms, sermons, and veterans' gatherings on both sides of the Atlantic. What had begun as a quiet act of conscience by a few weary farmers was now part of the moral archaeology of the war. The villagers had not sought that role, but history has a way of appointing witnesses where it finds courage. The churchyard, empty since the exhumations, had grown over with grass and violets. Children played there again, unaware of what once lay beneath. Yet every spring, on the anniversary of the burial, someone, no one ever knew who, would leave a single bouquet of wildflowers in the center of the field. It became a ritual without priest or calendar, a private liturgy of remembrance. In 1953, a letter arrived from across the ocean. It bore the seal of the United States Air Force and an unfamiliar name, Major Harold Morgan. The same man who had survived the crash now wrote to say he was returning to Germany, this time not as a soldier, but as a pilgrim. When he arrived, gray at the temples but still sharp-eyed, the villagers greeted him with a quiet that bordered on reverence. "I wanted to see where decency lived," he told them. "I wanted to thank those who proved the war didn't win." That evening they gathered in the rebuilt church. The smell of beeswax and old timber filled the air. Major Morgan stood before them and read aloud from his crew's logbook, its pages brittle, the ink faded. April 13th, 1945. Flak over Mersburg. Right engine hit. Parachutes deployed. God help us all. When he finished, no one spoke. The silence was not awkward, but sacred, as though the past itself were holding its breath. Outside, a photographer from Stars and Stripes captured an image that would circle the world, the American veteran shaking hands with Otto Klein beneath the same church steeple that had survived the bombings. In the background, children held small American and German flags side by side. The headline read, "Enemies once, brothers now." The paradox was complete. A village once condemned for mercy was now praised for it. Politicians sent letters. Church leaders cited Kleinrath in sermons about reconciliation. The mayor received invitations to conferences on peace and remembrance. For a time, Kleinrath became a symbol of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, the struggle to come to terms with the past. Yet some in the village resisted the attention. "We did what anyone should do," said Marta Bauer, now frail but still sharp. "It wasn't heroism, it was decency. Decency shouldn't need applause." Still, the stories multiplied. Local students collected testimonies for school projects. Veterans groups sent donations to restore the church. A small memorial stone was finally erected, not by the Americans, but by the villagers themselves. It bore no national symbols, only an inscription in both languages. Here, enemies became men. Every number surrounding that stone carried weight. 45,000 Allied aircraft lost over Europe, 600,000 German civilians killed by bombing, 280,000 American dead repatriated. Against those statistics, 5 graves in a forgotten village seemed mathematically insignificant. Yet morally they outweighed entire divisions. "History remembers armies," said Herr Vogel, the teacher, now nearly blind. "But sometimes history changes because of a single shovel of earth." By the end of the decade, tourists began to visit. Some were relatives of airmen, others were German families searching for a gentler narrative than guilt. The villagers welcomed them with coffee, bread, and quiet humility. Forgiveness had become their inheritance, and also their burden. But as the Cold War deepened and Europe rebuilt, Kleinrath's story risked fading into nostalgia. The world preferred grand victories, not small mercies. Yet those who had lived through it knew that history's true redemption often begins in whispers, not in parades. And one day, when the old school teacher died, his final request was simple: to be buried near the place where the Americans had once lain. Because, he said, that ground remembers who we were at our best. The villagers granted his wish, and with his passing, a new generation inherited not just a story, but a lesson. The lesson that compassion, once shown, can echo longer than any command ever given, and soon that echo would travel far beyond Germany's borders. Half a century later, the village of Kleinrath looked nothing like the black and white photographs that had once defined it. The cobblestone streets were clean, the roofs red again, the church steeple restored. Only the faint outline of the old airfield remained, a field of barley now, golden and silent under summer skies. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the war's end, a small crowd gathered before the memorial stone. Among them were gray-haired men in American Legion caps, local school children holding daisies, and the last few villagers who had lived through that spring of 1945. The air was warm, filled with the hum of bees and the distant toll of the same church bell that had once rung for the dead. A translator stood beside a visiting U.S. Air Force colonel who began to read a message from Washington. To the people of Kleinrath, you honored our fallen when the world was still learning what peace meant. You taught that compassion is not a weakness, but the first step toward lasting freedom. The words drifted over the square like incense. Some of the children fidgeted, not quite understanding the gravity of the ceremony. Yet their parents watched with quiet eyes, aware that they stood on soil consecrated not by victory, but by mercy. Later, in the small local museum, visitors examined faded photographs. Otto Klein with the Americans, Marta Bauer at the funeral, the crash site marked by a single wooden cross. Each picture carried a kind of fragile defiance, proof that goodness could exist even when surrounded by ruin. A journalist from Der Spiegel wrote that day, "Kleinrath's true monument is not stone, but memory, a memory that refuses to choose between grief and grace." As decades passed, the story found new life online. The black and white photo of Major Morgan shaking hands with Otto Klein began circulating on social media, captioned simply, "They buried their enemies with honor." Young viewers shared it, often without knowing the full history, yet something in the image resonated, a hunger for decency in a cynical age. Teachers used it in lessons about ethics, soldiers cited it in peacekeeping briefings, and descendants of both sides left digital candles beneath the image every Memorial Day. In 2015, a documentary crew visited the village. The filmmaker, an American whose grandfather had flown in the same bomber group as Morgan, asked the remaining witnesses what they wanted future generations to remember. Frau Klein, Otto's daughter, now in her 70s, answered simply, that there is no such thing as an enemy once the suffering is shared. The line became the closing quote of the film, projected in silence over footage of the barley field, the memorial stone, and the evening light sinking behind the steeple. The documentary aired across Europe and America. Letters poured in from veterans, teachers, and children who had never known war. Many said the same thing. It made me believe people can still be good. The village council voted soon after to make the site a Peace Heritage Landmark, not for tourism, but for continuity. Each year, local students take turns tending the grounds, learning the names, reciting the story aloud. And so, 8 decades after the crash, the soil of Kleinrath still teaches. It teaches that history's redemption does not come from victory parades or treaties, but from moments when humanity refuses to vanish, even in the aftermath of violence. Somewhere beneath that barley field lie traces of aluminum, bone, and iron. Time will dissolve them all. But the act, the choice to honor, to humanize, remains intact, unburied. Because compassion, once given, becomes a kind of inheritance the world cannot bomb away. And in the stillness of that village, where once the engines roared and the earth burned, the echo of mercy endures, clearer than any gunfire, lasting longer than any flag. History often remembers the fire, the bombs, the battles, the flags raised in triumph, but in the end, it is the quieter moments that save us. A handful of villagers standing over enemy graves, a mother who lights a candle for someone else's son, a soldier who lowers his weapon long enough to see a human face. Kleinrath's story is not about war. It's about what follows when the guns stop, the fragile space where forgiveness begins to grow. They had every reason to hate, yet chose to honor. They had lost everything, yet gave back dignity to the fallen. And in doing so, they left behind a truth greater than any victory, that compassion is not born from power, but from pain, shared and transcended. In the final measure of history, they were no longer enemies, only people who had lived through the same night and chosen to keep the light burning.